Well, I guess it depends on what the goal is. I mean, if you think that, if you're asking, are we inevitably moving towards some kind of military confrontation with Iran, the answer to that is a definitive no, because there is no military option when it comes to Iran. There's no military option for the United States, and there's no military option for Israel. There's a lot of reasons for this that we can get into in the answer and question period, but I do think that we should all bear in mind that Robert Gates has unequivocally taken the military option off the table. And with regard to this issue about whether Israel is going to act unilaterally, there is no such thing as a unilateral action on the part of Israel when it comes to Iran, for a couple of reasons, the most important of which is that Israel has to go across Iraqi airspace in order to attack Iran, and guess who controls Iraqi airspace? You know, the issue, I think, is one of, if you're talking about sort of inevitabilities here, is it inevitable that Iran is going to weaponize its nuclear program? Nobody knows. Let's just be clear on this right now. The intelligence estimates change on a yearly basis. In 2005, 2006, the intelligence community in the United States was almost unanimous in its decision that Iran had abandoned its weapons program. 2008, 2009, that opinion has changed. And as far as Israeli intelligence goes, Israeli intelligence has been saying Iran is 12 to 18 months from a nuclear weapon for 10 years now. So we don't know. That's just the fact. What we do know, however, and what is becoming increasingly clear, is that if Iran actually wants to build a nuclear weapon, we don't know if they do, but if they want to build a nuclear weapon, it seems like there's very little anyone can do to put a stop to it. And so that means that to deal with Iran's nuclear ambitions, we have to answer two questions. One of them is, why would Iran want a nuclear weapon? And the answer to that, I think, is pretty obvious. I mean, it's meant to be as a security guarantee. It's a deterrent, like every country in the world who wants a nuclear weapon. There's nothing extraordinary, nothing unusual about Iran whatsoever, or about the way that it would use a nuclear weapon if it were to have one. It is, after all, a country that's literally surrounded by American troops. I mean, literally surrounded by American troops. And it's a country that, despite the security threat that Israel faces from it, it's a country that, as we sit here today, has an untold number of Israeli nuclear weapons pointed at it right now. So, it doesn't take a genius to figure out why Iran would want a nuclear weapon. As I sometimes flippantly say, Iran learned a pretty valuable lesson from its fellow Axis of Evil members, right? One of them didn't have nuclear weapons. It was destroyed and occupied. The other one does have nuclear weapons. We're still pouring tens of billions of dollars into North Korea just to get them to talk to us about their weapons. So the first issue is, how do we get them to not want one? The second issue is, I think that if we're going to continue to think of Iran's nuclear program as an Iranian problem, then we will never solve it, because it's not an Iranian problem. It's a regional problem, but more importantly, it's an anti-proliferation problem. And until we can figure out a way to construct a more solid basis for an anti-proliferation regime, something much more solid than the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the primary document that we have right now, we're going to have countries like Iran popping up every few years. I think Barack Obama is right. We are fast approaching a world in which either everyone will have nuclear weapons or no one will have nuclear weapons. And until we figure out which one of those two things we're willing to live with, the problem of Iran will be a problem that we're going to face over and over again throughout the region.
Well, let me amplify a little bit on what Reza talked about, because he actually hit upon some very, very important points with regard to proliferation, with regard to sort of the regional perspective. Let me say this: I'm a talking head in Washington. In lieu of a real job, I sit around and throw ideas at the wall all day. So I wouldn't necessarily say that what you're going to hear from me is representative of the country as a whole, but I do spend a lot of time talking to policymakers in Congress, so I can at least tell you with a little bit of sincerity what they're thinking. And what they're thinking is that there are essentially three choices when it comes to Iran. there's accommodation, the idea that Iran is building a nuclear program and there's not much that we can do about it, and therefore we don't do anything at all. There is the central point, which is containment, which is a fancy way of saying doing nothing. And this essentially takes the paradigm of our fight against the Soviet Union and says, well, the Soviets had nukes and we had nukes and we didn't blow each other up, and so everything's fine. And by the way, that's the job that Congress likes the best because they don't like to do a lot of work. So when they think, oh, wait, if the Iranians just get nukes, then we'll have a stable deterrence paradigm and everything will be fine and we don't have to come in on weekends and we don't have to log in great hours. And they really like this idea. The problem, of course, with the containment paradigm is that Iran is not the Soviet Union. Iran possesses most immediately an ideological component and a religious component that the USSR never did. And so, and also there's a lot of pesky details, like the fact that we don't have steady communications with the Iranians. Like we don't have a good idea of their intentions or their red lines. These were all prerequisites to having a stable deterrent relationship with the Soviets. With the Soviets, we theoretically had an idea that we could figure out more or less what they would do under any circumstance in any given time. And that's what made MAD, mutually assured destruction, that's what made MAD work. We don't have all those components, all those ingredients necessary for stable containment and deterrence of the Iranians. So that option's, I think, fairly problematic. And then on the right side of the spectrum is this idea of confrontation, the idea that a nuclear Iran, whether it's a nascent nuclear program, and you hear a lot about the Japanese model, the model of nuclear development stopping just shy of having an offensive capability so that they can just sprint across the offensive threshold if they feel threatened. This is a little bit academic, I think, because what you're talking about is a country building an infrastructure that supports a nuclear weapons program. And the fundamental choice that we have to make, and let's be clear, I think Reza's right, we haven't made it yet. I think the policy community in Washington is very, very divided, is whether or not we can live with this regime acquiring this capability in this way at this time. The Obama administration has spent the last 15 months or so testing the proposition. And the proposition happens to be, is it possible for us to reach some sort of negotiated accommodation with the Iranians? An accommodation that respects their right to nuclear energy, but at the same time constrains their development and makes it more transparent. And what we've discovered over the last 15 months or so is that it may be, but the ingredients aren't there for us to build that type of paradigm, at least not right now. In fact, what you've been noticing, if you've been reading the press, is that the regime has very deftly used the last year and a little bit more than a quarter of the strategic pause that we've inserted. And I like to use that word because you understand that when diplomacy comes up, threats go down, the possibility of military action goes down, the possibility of sanctions goes down. The regime has used that as a window of opportunity to forge ahead with its nuclear program, including the disclosure of sites like the Qum pilot plant, which is not very useful for energy generation, but really useful if you want to build a nuclear weapon, including disclosure of plans to build a neutron initiator, which is essentially a trigger for a nuclear weapon, which you don't need in a civilian nuclear program. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence there that makes the international community and policy makers in Washington that I talk to very nervous that this isn't just a peaceful program and that they have to do something about it. As Reza said, there's a great deal of plurality and a great deal of problematic elements relating to a military option, as well as relating to economic warfare, as well as relating to sanctions. And I think these are all, we're right in the middle of a very heated policy discussion in Washington about what to do about it. For those of you that haven't paid attention, there is a great deal of congressional action coming down the pike in the next several weeks on precisely this, on whether or not energy sanctions should be levied against Iran, what are the next steps now that diplomacy has broken down. For my money, I think it's all going to boil down to one simple question. It's whether or not we think it's possible, using all these different inducements, to modify the behavior of the current rulers in Iran enough to be livable, or if you need something more fundamental. If the problem is not the nuclear program, but the problem is the regime that wields it, then we have a real problem.
Well, Roxana, you're the only one here who's lived in Iran for extended periods of time. When you hear that kind of talk out of Washington, does it strike you as realistic? Do you think?
Well, I think the problem is that people in the international community just don't really know what exactly to do with Iran. And it seems like the majority view in the West right now is to focus on sanctions on at least Revolutionary Guard entities as the best of the last few remaining alternatives, according to the supporters of these kinds of sanctions. And those supporters say maybe this could impact the Revolutionary Guards to a certain extent without hurting the ordinary people as much as other steps would.